The morning of February 16, 1944, broke gray and cold over the Pacific Ocean, 32.6 kilometers off Truk Atolls in the Caroline Islands. Through the salt-crusted viewport of the Japanese destroyer, Hayate Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Takeda stood frozen at his optical rangefinder, his hands trembling against the cold metal housing. He was 34 years old, the son of a Tsushima hero, a graduate of the Imperial Naval Academy's elite gunnery program. For 12 years he had trained for this moment, this war, this doctrine. His eyes, tested at 2010 visual acuity, could resolve details at distances that made other men squint. His mind could calculate firing solutions faster than men twice his age. He was by every measure his Navy valued perfect. And yet, staring through the rangefinder at two massive silhouettes on the distant horizon, Hiroshi Takeda felt something he had never experienced in his entire naval career. Fear. Not the clean fear of a combat, the adrenaline that sharpened senses and quickened reflexes. This was something deeper, something that struck at the foundation of everything he believed. Because what he was witnessing at this impossible distance should not be possible. The American battleships were 35,700 yards away, 20 miles. Beyond the visible horizon, at this range, Takeda could barely resolve their profiles even with Japan's finest optical equipment. They were shadows, ghosts, more suggestion than certainty. Then they opened fire. The sound reached him, first a distant thunder that rolled across the ocean like a storm announcing itself. Then came the shells. Takeda heard them before he saw them, that distinctive shriek of 16-inch projectiles tearing through air, a sound like the sky itself ripping open. The first salvo landed 200 meters off Hayate's port beam. Columns of water erupted skyward, towering geysers that rose 100 feet, maybe more, backlit by the gray dawn. The concussion wave hit the destroyer's hull like a physical blow, and men stumbled on the deck, grabbing for handholds. Takeda's rangefinder operator, a young seaman named Yuki, 20 years old with eyes almost as good as Takeda's own, turned from his scope with an expression that would haunt Takeda for the rest of his life. Not fear exactly, something worse. Disbelief. "Sir," Yuki's voice cracked, "the enemy is achieving accurate fire from a range where we cannot even establish proper optical track. How is this possible?" Takeda had no answer. Everything in his training, every doctrine manual he had memorized, every tactical assumption his Navy had built over 40 years, told him this should not be happening. Effective gunnery at 35,000 yards required visual confirmation of fall of shot. You fired, you watched where the shells landed, you corrected. It was a process that demanded clear sight lines, stable conditions, and most importantly, the ability to see your target clearly enough to adjust. The Americans were hitting near them from beyond the visible horizon, from a range where Japanese optics could barely resolve the targets, where their own guns would be firing blind. Evasive maneuvers. Takeda heard himself order, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. Full speed. Pattern Delta 7. Lay smoke. Hayate's engines screamed to full power. The destroyer heeled hard to starboard, black smoke pouring from her stacks, mixing with the chemical smoke generators that painted the ocean with concealing fog. The ship zigzagged, desperately executing the evasion pattern that doctrine prescribed for long-range fire. It didn't matter. The second salvo landed closer, the third closer still. Each adjustment precise, methodical, as if the enemy could see through the smoke, through the haze, through the very curvature of the earth itself. Takeda understood then, in that moment of thunder and spray and impossible accuracy, that everything he believed about naval warfare had just become obsolete. Somewhere on the horizon, invisible and invincible, the Americans had changed the rules. 8,000 miles away and 15 hours earlier, in a different ocean under different stars, Lieutenant Robert Chen had been checking his equipment with the methodical care of a man who trusted machines more than instinct. 28 years old, born in San Francisco to parents who had come from Guangdong province, seeking a better life, Bobby Chen represented everything the new American Navy valued. MIT education cut short by Pearl Harbor, a mind that understood electrical engineering and analog computation. And most importantly, a willingness to believe that the future of warfare belonged not to the man with the sharpest eyes, but to the man with the better system. The fire control room of USS Iowa was cramped, dimly lit, filled with the hum of electronics and the soft clicking of mechanical computers. Chen stood before the Mark 8 radar console, watching green phosphor traces paint pictures of an ocean his eyes would never see in such detail. Beside him, Chief Petty Officer Samuel Morrison watched with the skepticism of a man who had learned his craft in a different era. At 42, Morrison had been in the Navy since 1918. He had learned gunnery on ships where range finding meant putting your eye to an optical instrument and trusting your judgment. He had gray in his hair and scars from the last war, and he looked at Chen's electronic marvel with the cautious respect a master craftsman gives a machine that threatens to make him obsolete. "How's she looking, kid?" Morrison's voice carried the flat vowels of Nebraska, where he had been born to a farming family that never quite understood why their son wanted to go to sea. Chen didn't look up from the scope. "System is nominal, Chief. Radar tracking at full range. Mark 8 Rangekeeper is calibrated. We could shoot accurately at 40,000 yards if we had a target." Morrison grunted, moved to the optical rangefinder station out of pure habit. Through the viewport, he could see the gray expanse of the Pacific, empty and vast. "You ever think about what happens when that fancy equipment breaks down in the middle of a fight? That's why we have redundancy, Chief. 2 complete fire control systems. If one fails, we switch to the backup. And if both fail," Chen finally looked up, met the older man's eyes, "then you do it the old way. But that won't happen. Kid, I've been in this Navy 25 years. Rule number 1, everything breaks eventually." It was an old argument between them, comfortable and familiar. Chen had come aboard Iowa 8 months ago, fresh from fire control, school full of theoretical knowledge and absolute faith in integrated systems. Morrison had been assigned to train him in optical ranging, the traditional skills that the Navy still considered essential backup. They had learned from each other, Chen teaching Morrison the basics of radar theory, how electromagnetic waves bounced off metal hulls and returned to paint pictures on phosphor screens. Morrison teaching Chen the feel of optical ranging, the subtle art of judging distance by sight alone, the way atmospheric conditions affected visibility, the human element that no machine could quite replicate. Respect had grown between them, the kind that forms between men who serve together in close quarters, who depend on each other, who understand that survival might someday hinge on both the old skills and the new. "Run another calibration check," Morrison said finally. "Captain wants us ready for anything once we reach the operations area." Chen nodded, turned back to his console. His fingers moved across switches and dials with practiced precision. The Mark 8 system responded, its mechanical brain calculating solutions to problems that hadn't yet presented themselves. Neither man knew that in less than 20 hours, they would prove to the world that warfare had fundamentally changed. Hiroshi Takeda's journey to that moment of revelation off Truk Atoll had begun 12 years earlier in the spring of 1932, when he first walked through the gates of the Imperial Naval Academy at Itajima. He was 22, then slight of build but intense, carrying the weight of a family legacy that both inspired and burdened him. His father, Captain Kenji Takeda, had served on the battleship Mikasa during the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, that legendary victory where Admiral Togo's fleet had annihilated the Russian Baltic fleet in the straits between Korea and Japan. Takeda Sr. had been a gunnery officer, one of the men whose precise shooting had sent Russian battleship after Russian battleship to the bottom. He had come home, a hero, had risen to command his own ship, had retired with honor and medals and the absolute certainty that he understood how wars at sea were won. One decisive battle, perfect execution, overwhelming victory. The doctrine had a name, Kantai Kessen, the decisive fleet engagement. And it wasn't just strategy. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, it was religion philosophy, the organizing principle around which everything else revolved. Young Hiroshi had grown up hearing the stories. His father's voice describing the moment when Mikasa's guns found their range, when Russian armor proved inadequate, when the sea itself seemed to rise up and swallow the enemy fleet. The lesson was clear, repeated until it became part of Hiroshi's very identity. Build the most powerful ships. Train your crews to perfection. Choose your moment. Destroy the enemy in one crushing engagement that would force them to negotiate peace. At the Naval Academy, Hiroshi had excelled. The entrance examination tested mathematical ability and visual acuity, and Hiroshi had scored in the top 5% in both categories. He was selected for the elite optical gunnery program, where only the best students were admitted. His instructors taught him to use the Type 94 stereoscopic rangefinder, the finest optical ranging instrument in the world. They taught him the Type 92 Shigekiban fire control computer, a mechanical marvel of gears and cams that could calculate ballistic solutions with impressive accuracy. They taught him doctrine close to medium range around 20,000 yards, where Japanese optical superiority and crew training would deliver decisive hits. Everything Hiroshi learned reinforced the same message: Japanese naval technology and Japanese naval skill were superior. The Americans were building larger fleets, yes, but American ships would be slower, clumsier, their crews less skilled. When Kantai Kessen came, when the decisive battle finally arrived, Japanese excellence would prevail. Hiroshi believed it absolutely. How could he not? His father had lived it. His instructors taught it. The entire structure of the Imperial Navy embodied it. He graduated second in his class in 1936, was commissioned as an ensign, was assigned to the light cruiser Notori. For 5 years, he honed his skills. He could operate a rangefinder with such precision that his measurements varied less than 50 yards at 20,000. He could calculate firing solutions in his head, checking the mechanical computer's work, often finding small errors before they became problems. In 1941, Hiroshi Takeda was promoted to lieutenant commander and given a posting he had dreamed of: gunnery officer on the destroyer Hayate. He was 31 years old at the peak of his abilities, ready to prove his worth in the great conflict everyone knew was coming. When the war began with the attack on Pearl Harbor, Hiroshi felt something close to exhilaration. Finally, after years of training, the opportunity to serve, the opportunity to honor his father's legacy, the opportunity to participate in Kantai Kessen, that decisive battle that would determine the fate of nations. The early victories seemed to confirm everything. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval aviation had devastated the American Pacific Fleet. In the months that followed, Japanese forces swept across the Pacific with stunning speed. Singapore fell, the Philippines fell, the Dutch East Indies fell. Japanese naval skill, Japanese naval power seemed unstoppable. Hiroshi remembered the day in December 1941 when news reached them that Yamato had been commissioned, the largest battleship ever built. 72,000 tons of steel and fury, 9 18.1-inch guns, the most powerful naval weapons in history. Each shell weighed 3,220 pounds and could travel 42 kilometers. Yamato was more than a ship. She was the physical embodiment of Kantai Kessen, the ultimate expression of Japan's faith in decisive battle. With Yamato and her sister Musashi, how could Japan lose? Hiroshi had written to his wife that night, a letter full of confidence and pride. Sachiko was waiting for him in Tokyo with their daughter Hana, then 3 years old. He told her about Yamato, about the coming victory, about how the war would end with one magnificent naval battle, and then he would come home. He believed every word. But by late 1943, small doubts had begun to creep in. Intelligence reports described American battleships of a new type. Fast battleships able to keep pace with aircraft carriers. Long, sleek profiles unlike the stocky American ships from before the war. Speeds exceeding 30 knots, which should have been impossible for ships that size. Hiroshi read the reports and dismissed them. Battleships were fortresses, not racehorses. The Americans were probably exaggerating specifications, trying to intimidate. Then came the reports of long-range gunnery, American ships bombarding shore positions from distances that seemed impossible. 16-inch shells landing with uncanny accuracy and poor visibility even at night. Japanese observers on various islands reported bombardments that defied tactical assumptions. Still, Hiroshi rationalized. Shore bombardment was different from ship-to-ship combat. Fixed targets versus moving ones. Perhaps the Americans had developed better techniques for that specific mission. He never quite let himself believe that the fundamental rules had changed, because accepting that would mean accepting that everything he had trained for, everything his father had believed, everything the Imperial Navy had built, might be based on assumptions that were no longer valid. And that was a thought too terrible to contemplate. Until February 16, 1944, when the shells started falling from the invisible horizon and doubt became certainty. Bobby Chen's path to that same moment had been very different, but no less deliberate. He had grown up in San Francisco's Chinatown, the youngest son of immigrants who ran a small restaurant on Grand Avenue. His father had come to America in 1910, working first on the railroads, then in the city, eventually saving enough to bring over a wife from his home province and start a family. The Chen family restaurant was modest but successful enough. Bobby's older brothers were expected to help in the business to eventually take it over. But Bobby, from his earliest years, had shown a different aptitude. He was fascinated by how things worked, by the invisible forces that made radios broadcast and engines run and lights illuminate. His high school science teacher, a patient man named Mr. Harrison, had recognized something special. He encouraged Bobby to apply to college, helped him navigate the application process, wrote recommendations that emphasized not just intelligence, but creative problem-solving ability. MIT accepted him in 1938. Bobby Chen, 18 years old, became the first person in his family to attend university. His parents were proud and bewildered in equal measure. They had sacrificed to give him this opportunity, even as they quietly wished he would study something practical, like engineering that could help the restaurant, rather than pure mathematics and electrical theory. At MIT, Bobby discovered radar. It was still experimental, that is still classified, but rumors filtered through the engineering department about British work on radio detection and ranging. The concept fascinated him, using electromagnetic waves to see what human eyes could not, turning the invisible into the measurable. He had a professor, Dr. John Williams, who became his mentor. Williams had done consulting work for the Navy and understood that radar would revolutionize warfare. He taught Bobby not just the mathematics of electromagnetic propagation, but the philosophy of systems thinking. The future, Williams told his students in a lecture Bobby never forgot, belongs to those who can integrate technologies. A radar alone is just a sensor. A computer alone is just a calculator. But combine them, create a feedback loop, add servo motors and gyroscopic stabilization, and suddenly you have something greater than the sum of parts. You have a system that can do what no human could do alone. Bobby had been working on a senior thesis about analog fire control computation when Pearl Harbor happened, December 7th, 1941. He was in the library when someone ran in with the news. Japanese aircraft had attacked the Pacific Fleet. Battleships were sinking. Thousands were dead. Bobby remembered walking back to his dormitory in a daze. His parents had come from China. Japan and China had been at war since 1937. Bobby had relatives, cousins he had never met, living under Japanese occupation. And now Japan had attacked America, his country, while pretending to negotiate peace. He didn't finish his thesis. He enlisted the next morning, walked into a Navy recruiting office in Boston, and said he wanted to serve. The recruiter looked at his MIT transcripts, looked at his face, and made a decision that would shape Bobby's war. "We need technical specialists," the recruiter said, "men who understand electronics and computation. You interested in fire control systems?" Bobby nodded. He barely knew what fire control systems were, but he understood electronics and computation, and he understood that he wanted to be part of defeating the people who had killed Americans while talking peace. The Navy sent him to fire control school in Philadelphia. There, for 6 intense months in 1942, Bobby learned about the Mark 38 gunfire control system, the most sophisticated naval weapon system in the world. It was everything Dr. Williams had described, an integrated system where each component enhanced the others. The Mark 8 fire control radar could track targets at 45,000 yards, painting detailed pictures even in darkness or fog. That data fed into the Mark 8 Rangekeeper, an analog computer weighing 2,000 pounds, filled with gears and servos and mechanical genius. The Rangekeeper didn't just calculate where a target was, it calculated where the target would be when the shells arrived, accounting for target speed, target bearing range rate, wind, air temperature, even the rotation of the Earth. It output electrical signals that automatically position the guns, adjusting elevation, and traverse faster and more accurately than any human gun crew. Add in gyroscopic stabilization that compensated for the ship's own motion, and you had a system that could maintain accurate fire while maneuvering at 30 knots in heavy seas. You could shoot at targets you couldn't see with your eyes in conditions where optical ranging would be impossible. Bobby's instructor, a gruff lieutenant commander who had served on older battleships, put it bluntly, "Gentlemen, you're not learning to aim guns. You're learning to operate an integrated weapon system. The ship is your platform. The radar is your eyes. The computer is your brain. The guns are just execution. Master the system, and you can hit targets that optical range finding could never engage effectively." Bobby mastered the system. He graduated top of his class. In February 1943, fresh from school, he reported aboard USS Iowa for her commissioning ceremony. Iowa was breathtaking. 860 feet long, sleek and purposeful, every line designed for speed. Her 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers could generate 212,000 shaft horsepower, pushing her to 33 knots. Her 9 16-inch Mark 7 guns could hurl 2,700-pound shells beyond the horizon. But what really mattered, what made Iowa revolutionary, was invisible from the outside. The Mark 38 directors rising above the main deck, the radar arrays, the fire control computers, the remote power control that made the massive gun turrets respond to electronic signals like extensions of the system itself. Iowa was built to do what Yamato could never do, fight effectively at any range, in any weather, day or night, while moving at speeds that would let her choose when to engage and when to disengage. Bobby reported to the Fire Control Division and met Chief Petty Officer Samuel Morrison. Morrison was everything Bobby wasn't. Old Navy experience, skeptical of newfangled electronics. He had served on the battleship Texas during World War I, had learned optical range finding, when that was the only option, had decades of experience trusting his eyes and his instruments. Their first conversation set the tone for everything that followed. "So you're the MIT kid," Morrison said, looking Bobby up and down. "You know how to actually operate a rangefinder? Or just the theory?" "I know the theory, Chief. I'm here to learn the practice." Morrison grunted. "Theory gets you killed. Practice keeps you alive. Come on, I'll show you what real gunnery looks like." But Morrison wasn't cruel, just thorough. He taught Bobby optical ranging with patience, explaining how atmospheric conditions affected visibility, how to judge distance by ways in detail, how to feel when a firing solution was right. The old skills passed down through generations of sailors. And Bobby, to his surprise, taught Morrison about the new systems. One night during a quiet watch, he showed the chief how the radar worked, explaining electromagnetic wave propagation in simple terms, demonstrating how the scope painted pictures of reality. Morrison listened, asked questions, finally nodded slowly. "So this thing can see in the dark, and in fog, and rain, and smoke, and beyond the horizon. And you trust it?" Bobby met his eyes. "Chief, I trust mathematics, I trust physics, I trust systems that have been tested. This system works." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something Bobby would remember forever. "Kid, in my experience, the best tool is the one you understand completely. I understand optical ranging. I don't fully understand your radar, but I'm willing to learn because I've been in this Navy long enough to know that the side that adapts faster usually wins." Mutual respect grew from that conversation. Morrison became more than Bobby's supervisor. He became his mentor, his guide to the unwritten rules of Navy life, his connection to traditions that Bobby needed to understand even as he helped build the future. By February 1944, they had worked together for nearly a year. Bobby was no longer the green ensign fresh from school. He had supervised countless drills, maintained the systems through rough seas, and mechanical problems earned his place in the Fire Control Division. But he had never fired in combat, never tracked a real enemy, never calculated solutions for shells that would actually kill men. That was about to change. Iowa and her sister ship New Jersey had been operating with the fast carrier task forces, screening the flat tops from surface threats, providing anti-aircraft support, bombarding shore positions. In February 1944, the carriers launched Operation Hailstone, a massive strike against Truk Atoll, Japan's primary forward naval base in the Central Pacific. While carrier aircraft pounded the anchorage, Iowa and New Jersey detached from the screen to conduct an anti-shipping sweep. Their mission: intercept and destroyed any Japanese vessels attempting to escape. Dawn on February 16th found them prowling north of the atoll, radars sweeping the ocean for targets. Bobby was at his station in the fire control room when the call came over the intercom. "Fire control bridge, radar contact bearing 315 range, 36,000 yards. Designate target Alpha. Appears to be destroyer-type vessel. Target is maneuvering at high speed." Bobby's hands moved across his console, fingers dancing over switches. The radar painted a clear picture, a single ship moving fast, zigzagging in what looked like an evasion pattern. "Chief, I have solid track on target Alpha," Bobby reported. Morrison was at the optical station, squinting through the viewport. "Can't see anything, kid. Too much haze and distance. Radar has him locked. Inputting to rangekeeper now." The mechanical computer word to life calculating. Range 36,000 yards. Target speed 28 knots. Target bearing changing as it zigzagged. Wind speed 8 knots from the northeast. Air temperature 62 degrees. Ballistic coefficient for the Mark 8 armor-piercing shell. The solution locked in less than 10 seconds. Bridge fire control. Solution locked on target Alpha. Ready to commence firing. The captain's voice came back calm and certain. Fire control bridge. You are authorized to engage target Alpha. Commence firing. Bobby took a breath. This was it. Everything he had trained for. He pressed the firing key. The ship shuddered as all 9 16-inch guns fired in a single massive salvo. The sound was beyond description, a physical pressure that made the deck plates ring, and the air itself seemed to compress. Through the bulkheads, Bobby could hear the guns recoiling, the breaches opening, the loading crews ramming fresh shells home. He watched his radar scope tracking the target, watched the rangekeeper adjust for the ship's slight course change, watched the guns automatically elevate for the second salvo. 27 seconds after firing, Bobby watched his screen carefully. At this range, at this closing speed, the shells would be approaching the target now. Morrison, still at the optical station, suddenly straightened. Jesus Christ, I can see the splashes. Dead on target bearing, we straddled him, Chen, from a range where I can barely make out his silhouette. Bobby felt something cold settle in his chest. Intellectual satisfaction at system performance, yes, but also the first real understanding of what that system performance meant. Somewhere out there on a ship, Bobby could only see as a phosphor blip on a screen were men. Japanese sailors, probably terrified, probably wondering how the Americans were shooting so accurately from such an impossible distance. Men who were about to die because Bobby Chen had done his job perfectly. Maintain fire, the captain ordered. Target Alpha is attempting evasion. Stay on him. Bobby adjusted the solution. The rangekeeper compensated for the target's turns, predicting where it would be. The gun swiveled, automatically elevated, fired again. More splashes. Closer. The radar showed the target attempting desperate maneuvers, laying smoke, zigzagging frantically. The system tracked through all of it. Every turn, every course change. The mechanical brain calculated faster than any human could, fed corrections to the guns, maintained the solution. They fired 18 salvos over the next 30 minutes. Target Alpha survived only by radical maneuvering and some luck with rain squalls that degraded radar tracking for brief periods. But Iowa and New Jersey also destroyed a light cruiser and damaged 2 other vessels. When the engagement ended, Morrison turned to Bobby with an expression the younger man had never seen on the chief's weathered face. Kid, I've been ranging targets for 25 years. What we just did shouldn't be possible. But we did it anyway. Bobby nodded slowly. Welcome to the future, Chief. Yeah. Morrison looked at the radar console, then at his optical rangefinder, then back again. Yeah, I guess so. That night, alone in his bunk during off-watch hours, Bobby Chen tried to sleep and couldn't. He kept seeing that blip on the radar screen, that abstract representation of a ship full of men. He kept thinking about the shells, each one weighing more than a small car, screaming through the sky to explode among people who had probably never even seen the ship that killed them. The system worked perfectly. That was supposed to be good. That was what victory looked like in modern warfare. Efficient, precise, clinical. So why did Bobby feel like he had crossed some line he could never uncross? He thought of Dr. Williams at WWII teaching about integrated systems, about the elegance of feedback loops in servo mechanisms. Williams had never talked about this part, the part where your elegant system efficiently killed people. Bobby wondered if the Japanese had men like him, technical specialists, good at mathematics, trying to do their jobs, believing in their systems just as absolutely as Bobby believed in his. He wondered if he would ever meet one. If they would recognize each other as men who had chosen systems over instinct, future over tradition, efficiency over humanity. He wondered what they would say to each other if they did meet. Hiroshi Takeda stood on Hayate's bridge 3 hours after the engagement, watching the sun set over an ocean that suddenly seemed much larger and much more dangerous than it had at dawn. They had survived. Barely. The light cruiser Katori had not been so lucky, nor had the destroyer Maikaze. Both were gone, sent to the bottom by shells fired from beyond the visible horizon. Takeda had been ordered to write an after-action report. He sat in his cabin that evening, staring at blank paper, trying to find words for what he had witnessed. He wrote, "Enemy battleships achieved accurate fire at 35,700 yards in degraded visibility conditions. This exceeds all doctrine parameters for effective optical fire control. Multiple salvos demonstrated systematic correction and target tracking despite evasive maneuvering." Conclusion. Americans possess superior ranging technology, possibly electronic in nature. This represents fundamental change in naval warfare. Recommendation: urgent assessment and doctrinal revision required. He read it over. It sounded clinical, professional. It didn't capture the terror of watching shells fall from an enemy you couldn't effectively fight back against. It didn't capture the moment when Takeda realized that every assumption his Navy had built over 4 decades might be fatally flawed. But it was the truth, and Takeda still believed even after everything that truth mattered. He submitted the report to his captain, who forwarded it up the chain of command. 2 weeks later, Takeda was called to a meeting with Admiral Ozawa, commander of the Mobile Fleet. Ozawa read the report, set it down, looked at Takeda with an expression that mixed sympathy and frustration. "Takeda-san, you are suggesting that the Americans have some technological advantage that makes our doctrine obsolete." "Sir, I am reporting what I observed. They were achieving accurate fire at ranges where our optical systems could not establish proper track. More likely they were lucky, or you miscalculated range under stress. Sir, with respect, this was not one salvo. This was sustained fire over 30 minutes. Systematic correction. They could see us when we could not see them clearly." Ozawa sighed. "Lieutenant Commander, I understand you had a difficult experience, but we cannot abandon doctrine every time we encounter unexpected enemy action. Our optical ranging is the finest in the world. Our crews are the best trained. Our Kantai Kessen doctrine has been validated by decades of study and exercise. What you are suggesting would require us to question all of that." Takeda felt something inside him crack. Not break, not yet, but crack. "Sir, I am not questioning doctrine. I am reporting reality. Reality is that we are winning this war. Reality is that Yamato and Musashi give us decisive superiority. Reality is that when the great battle comes, our superior training and superior weapons will prevail." Ozawa's voice softened slightly. "Takeda-san, I know your father. He is a hero of Tsushima. Do not dishonor his legacy by spreading defeatist talk." The meeting ended. Takeda's report was filed somewhere and apparently forgotten. That night, Takeda wrote a letter to his wife. A real letter, not the censored official correspondence, but words he sealed and gave to the chaplain to deliver only if Takeda died in action. "Sachiko, I witnesses something today that shook everything I believe. I tried to report the truth and I was told I was wrong. Not because my observations were incorrect, but because they contradicted what we want to believe. Father always taught me that a warrior serves with honor and obeys without question. But what if the orders are based on assumptions that are no longer true? What if obedience means marching to death for no purpose except preserving someone's pride? I don't know anymore. I wish I could talk to Father. I wish I could ask him if he ever felt this doubt, this fear that everything you believed might be wrong. Kiss Hana for me. Tell her to grow up brave enough to question even when questioning is dangerous. That is the lesson I am learning, perhaps too late." He sealed the letter, gave it to the chaplain, and tried to sleep. In his dreams, he heard shells screaming from the invisible horizon and woke in the darkness of his cabin, wondering if he had just heard the future announcing itself. Across the Pacific, in the officer's wardroom of USS Iowa, Bobby Chen and Sam Morrison sat over coffee during a midnight watch break. "You did good today, kid," Morrison said quietly. "System worked like you said it would." Bobby stared into his cup. "I keep thinking about them. The men on those ships, what they must have thought. Best not to think about it too much." "How do you not think about it, Chief?" Morrison was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice carried weight Bobby had never heard before. "You know, I was at Belleau Wood First War. Marines were getting chewed up by German machine guns. I was on a destroyer providing fire support. We put 5-inch shells into those German positions until there wasn't anything left standing. Saved a lot of Marines that day. Killed a lot of Germans. Young men probably scared, probably just doing what they were told, like everyone in every war." He paused, stared at his own coffee. You want to know how I sleep? I tell myself that every German position we destroyed meant Marines who lived to go home. That's the math I live with. Our boys or theirs. We chose ours. Bobby nodded slowly. And that's enough. Has to be, because the alternative is going crazy thinking about all the things you can't change. Morrison paused. But kid, the fact that you're asking these questions, that's not weakness. That's humanity. Don't lose that. System works because you're smart. But stay human and you'll use that system right. Lose your humanity and you're just an efficient killer. There's a difference. They sat in silence for a while, two men from different generations bound by service and circumstances, trying to find meaning in a war that reduced humans to blips on radar screens and entries in fire control solutions. Neither of them knew that in the months ahead, the questions would only get harder and the answers even more elusive. But for now, in this quiet moment between battles, they had each other and the fragile comfort of knowing they were asking the right questions, even if there were no good answers. The war continued. The doctrine clashed with reality. And men on both sides, good men doing their duty, marched forward toward a reckoning that would prove once and for all whether faith and tradition could survive contact with the future. The thunder beyond the horizon had spoken. Now came the storm. Spring turned to summer in 1944, and with each passing month, the pattern became clearer. The war Hiroshi Takeda had trained for was not the war being fought. The decisive battle that doctrine promised kept receding like a mirage replaced by something newer, something his Navy had never quite prepared for. By June, Takeda had been transferred from Hayate to new orders. The destroyer needed repairs after Truk and Takeda's skills were needed elsewhere. When the assignment came through, he felt a mixture of honor and dread. Yamato, he was to join the gunnery staff of the largest battleship in the world, the embodiment of everything Kantai Kessen represented. It should have been the pinnacle of his career. Instead, it felt like being assigned to a magnificent museum piece, while the world outside changed beyond recognition. He reported aboard in early April 1944 at Linga Roads near Singapore, where Yamato had been stationed to be close to fuel sources. The ship was even more impressive in person than in photographs. Standing on her deck was like standing on a floating fortress armor, so thick it seemed nothing could penetrate it, guns so large they defied comprehension. Commander Yamada, the senior gunnery officer, gave Takeda the tour personally. Yamada was 55, a career gunnery specialist, a man who had spent 30 years perfecting the art of optical fire control. He walked Takeda through the systems with obvious pride. 9 18.1-inch guns, Yamada said, patting the massive turret of the number 2 main battery. Each shell weighs more than a truck. Range 42,000 meters in ideal conditions. When we engage the American battleships, Takeda-san, these guns will speak for the Empire. Takeda followed, listening, trying to feel the enthusiasm Yamada clearly expected. But he kept thinking of Truk of shells falling from beyond the visible horizon of systems that didn't require optical ranging at all. Commander Takeda asked carefully, what provisions have been made for engaging targets beyond optical range, in degraded visibility conditions? Yamada frowned slightly. We have Type 22 radar for surface search, but actual fire control remains optical, as it should be. Japanese rangefinders are the finest in the world. Our crews are trained to excellence. Why would we trust unreliable electronics over proven human skill? Sir, at Truk, I observed American ships achieving accurate fire at 35,000 yards in conditions where our optical systems could barely resolve the targets. Then they were lucky, or you miscalculated. Yamada's tone carried a note of warning. Doctrine is clear, Lieutenant Commander. We close to medium range 20 to 25,000 yards, where our optical superiority and training deliver decisive results. The Americans may have tricks, but in a proper battleship engagement skill and courage prevail. Takeda said nothing more. He had learned the futility of arguing with men who had built their entire careers on assumptions they couldn't afford to question. That evening, he wrote to Sachiko, a careful letter saying nothing that would alarm the censors, but trying to convey something of what he felt. I am now serving aboard Yamato, which is a great honor. The ship is magnificent, everything our nation's industry can produce, and yet I find myself troubled by questions I cannot fully express. Sometimes I wonder if magnificence and effectiveness are the same thing. Sometimes I wonder if we are building monuments when we should be building tools. But I do my duty as father taught me and trust that those above me see the larger picture I cannot. He sealed the letter knowing Sachiko would read between the lines, would understand the doubt he couldn't speak aloud. Across the Pacific, Bobby Chen was discovering that moral questions had a way of persisting even when you tried to ignore them. In May 1944, he was transferred to USS New Jersey, Iowa's sister ship, with a promotion to full lieutenant and the position of senior fire control officer. Morrison came with him, a decision the chief grumbled about, but secretly appreciated. They had become a team, the young technical specialist and the old-school rangefinder expert, balancing each other's strengths. New Jersey joined Task Force 58 for the invasion of the Mariana Islands. The operation was massive, involving hundreds of ships, and the battleships had multiple roles: screen the carriers, provide anti-aircraft support, bombard shore positions. On June 19th, during what would later be called the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Chen experienced combat in a form he hadn't anticipated. The Japanese launched massive air attacks against the carrier fleet, hundreds of aircraft, wave after wave, trying to overwhelm the American defenses. Chen's primary job was fire control for the main battery, but when the air attacks began, he found himself coordinating data for the 5-inch anti-aircraft guns as well. The Mark 37 fire control directors tracked incoming aircraft with radar-calculated lead angles, and firing solutions directed the 5-inch guns to engage targets that appeared as dots on the horizon. The system worked with brutal efficiency. Aircraft after aircraft fell from the sky, shot down by radar-directed fire that made traditional anti-aircraft gunnery look primitive by comparison. Chen watched the radar returns disappear one after another and knew each vanishing blip represented men dying. Young pilots, probably full of courage and determination, climbing into cockpits to attack a fleet they had been told they could defeat. He thought of his counterpart somewhere in Japan, some fire control officer who had helped prepare those pilots, who had believed in his nation's capabilities just as Chen believed in his systems. That officer was probably wondering now why so many aircraft weren't coming back, why American defenses were so effective. Morrison, watching Chen's face during a lull in the attacks, understood what he was seeing. "You're thinking about them again," the chief said quietly. "How can I not? We just shot down maybe 50 aircraft in an hour. That's hundreds of men. Men who were trying to sink our carriers and kill our sailors. You did your job, Chen. You kept our people alive." I know that's the right answer. But knowing it doesn't make it feel better." Morrison sighed. "War doesn't give us easy choices, kid. Just necessary ones. Remember that." By the end of the day, American pilots were calling it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese naval aviation had lost over 300 aircraft. American losses were minimal. The battle was a decisive victory, exactly the kind of engagement American doctrine was built for. But Chen took no joy in it, only a growing sense that efficiency in killing is still killing, no matter how justified. In July, New Jersey participated in shore bombardments of Tinian and Saipan. This was different from ship-to-ship combat. The targets were fixed positions, bunkers and artillery emplacements, and supply depots on island fortresses that had to be neutralized before Marines could land. Chen's job was to coordinate fire control for the 16-inch guns using aerial reconnaissance photos and grid coordinates to identify targets, calculating firing solutions for structures he could only see as marks on a map. The bombardment of Tinian lasted 3 days. New Jersey fired over 800 rounds of 16-inch ammunition. Each shell weighed either 2,700 pounds for armor piercing or 1,900 pounds for high-capacity, high-explosive. The high-capacity shells were designed for exactly this purpose. When they impacted, they created craters 50 feet wide and 20 feet deep. The blast could destroy concrete bunkers, collapse underground tunnels, kill anyone within hundreds of yards. Chen calculated trajectories and firing solutions with precision. The radar-directed system meant they could fire accurately even when smoke from previous impacts obscured the target area. They could adjust fire based on aerial observation, walking shells across defensive positions with methodical thoroughness. It was effective, it was necessary, and it made Chen feel like he was operating a machine designed for industrial-scale death. On the third day, Morrison found him behind a gun mount, vomiting into the ocean. "Rough seas getting to you, kid." Chen wiped his mouth, shook his head. "I saw the aerial photos from after the bombardment. There's nothing left, Chief. We just erased everything in the target area, turned solid ground into a moonscape." Morrison was quiet for a moment. And tomorrow Marines land on that beach. They walk across ground we made safe. They take objectives without facing the fire from positions we destroyed. They go home to their families because we did our job. I calculated every shell, Chief. I watched them land. Then I saw what they did. Yeah, that's the burden. That's what comes with the system you operate. Morrison gripped Chen's shoulder. You can't carry what you can't change. Those positions had to be destroyed. Better our shells than our Marines' lives. That's not just words, kid. That's the only math that makes sense in this war. Chen nodded, but the weight didn't lift. For Hiroshi Takeda, serving aboard Yamato through the summer of 1944 became an exercise in cognitive dissonance. The ship was magnificent. The crew was skilled. The systems were well maintained. And yet Yamato spent most of her time anchored swinging at her moorings while the war raged elsewhere. The official reason was fuel conservation. Oil was becoming scarce and Yamato consumed vast quantities. Better to preserve her for the decisive moment than waste fuel on routine patrols. But Takeda suspected a deeper reason. The high command was afraid to risk her, afraid that the symbol of Japanese naval supremacy might be destroyed before the decisive battle arrived. And so Yamato waited and waited while smaller ships fought and died. In October, the waiting ended. American forces invaded the Philippines, landing at Leyte Gulf. This was it, the moment Kantai Kessen had promised. The Americans had committed their fleet to a major amphibious operation. They were exposed, their transports and supply ships vulnerable. If Japanese naval forces could break through and destroy the landing fleet, the American advance would be crippled. The plan was complex, involving multiple forces converging from different directions. But the heart of it was Center Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Kurita. And the heart of Center Force was Yamato and Musashi, the super battleships that would finally prove their worth. Takeda attended the briefing on October 20th with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Admiral Kurita stood before the assembled officers explaining the plan. Center Force would transit the Sibuyan Sea Pass through San Bernardino Strait and fall upon the American landing fleet from the north. Other forces would divert American attention. It would be coordination, timing, and overwhelming firepower. Gentlemen, Kurita said, his voice grave, this is the moment we have prepared for. The decisive battle. Yamato and Musashi will lead the attack. Your guns will speak for the Empire. Victory here will change the course of the war. Commander Yamato was enthusiastic during the preparation. Finally, Takeda-san, a proper battleship engagement. No more waiting. Tomorrow we show the Americans what Japanese gunnery can achieve. Takeda wanted to share the enthusiasm, wanted to believe that tomorrow would vindicate everything, that Kantai Kessen would prove itself, that all the training and doctrine would matter. But he kept remembering Truk, kept remembering shells from beyond the horizon, kept wondering if they were preparing for a battle that would never come. October 24th, 1944 dawned clear over the Sibuyan Sea. Center Force was in transit, making good speed towards San Bernardino Strait. On Yamato's bridge, lookouts scanned the horizons. Radar operators monitored their scopes. Gun crews stood ready. At 08:30, the radar reported aircraft contacts, many contacts. American carrier aircraft. Takeda was at his station in the fire control center when the first wave arrived. He could see them through the viewports, dozens of aircraft diving from altitude, torpedo bombers coming in low. But they weren't attacking Yamato. They were focusing on Musashi. He watched horrified as the attacks developed. Wave after wave after wave. Dive bombers and torpedo bombers coordinated attacks from multiple directions. Musashi's anti-aircraft guns fired frantically, filling the sky with tracers and explosions. But there were too many aircraft. Far too many. Takeda had helped develop anti-aircraft doctrine. It was based on assumptions about the number of attacking aircraft, the effectiveness of the Type 986 25mm guns, the ability of the crew to track and engage multiple targets. Those assumptions were being shattered. American carrier aviation was attacking with hundreds of aircraft, far more than Japanese doctrine had anticipated. The manual anti-aircraft guns couldn't track targets fast enough, couldn't engage enough aircraft simultaneously. And the Americans had learned. They attacked from multiple directions at once, forcing the battleship to divide her fire. They pressed their attacks through the flak with determination and skill. They coordinated torpedo attacks from both sides to prevent the ship from turning into the tracks. Takeda watched Musashi take hit after hit. Torpedoes slammed into her sides. Bombs penetrated her decks. The massive ship designed to survive anything was being systematically destroyed by an attack method doctrine had never adequately prepared for. By early afternoon, Musashi was clearly doomed, listing heavily fires burning flooding in multiple compartments. She struggled on her crew fighting with desperate courage to save her, but the damage was too much. At 1930 hours, Musashi capsized and sank. Over 1,000 men went down with her. Takeda stood on Yamato's deck as night fell, watching the position where Musashi had been. The sister ship, the twin symbol of Japanese naval supremacy, was gone. Destroyed not in a gun duel with enemy battleships, but by aircraft from carriers that had never come within range of Musashi's guns. Commander Yamada stood nearby, his face gray with shock. How? Yamada whispered, more to himself than to Takeda. How did they mass so many aircraft? Our intelligence said. Takeda said what Yamada couldn't. Our intelligence was wrong. Our assumptions were wrong. They have more carriers than we thought, better coordination, better aircraft. And our anti-aircraft defenses were designed for a different threat level. Yamada turned to him sharply. Are you saying doctrine is flawed? I'm saying reality doesn't match our assumptions, and Musashi paid the price. Center Force pressed on through the night through San Bernardino Strait. The mission was too important to abort despite the loss of Musashi. They had to reach the landing area, had to destroy the American transports, had to achieve something from this operation. Dawn on October 25th found them emerging from the strait into the Philippine Sea. Lookouts spotted masts on the horizon. American ships. This was it. The moment. The gun duel Yamato had been built for. Takeda was at his fire control station when the identification came through. The targets were not fleet carriers, not the main American battle line. They were escort carriers, small and lightly armored, and destroyers. Tiny ships with 5-inch guns. It should have been a massacre. Yamato's 18.1-inch guns against escort carriers with flight decks barely thicker than a cruiser's armor. Heavy cruisers in center force had 8-inch guns that could rip through destroyer hulls like paper. The order came: close range and engage. Commander Yamada was exultant. Finally, a proper surface engagement. Calculate firing solutions. Will destroy them all. Center force accelerated, closing the range. The American ships turned and ran, making smoke-launching aircraft calling desperately for help. At 28,000 yards, Yamato opened fire. Takeda was at the optical rangefinder tracking the lead escort carrier. The morning was clear, visibility good. Perfect conditions for optical fire control. Everything doctrine said they needed. He calculated the solution, manually cross-checked with the Type 92 computer. Range target, speed bearing. The mathematics were perfect. Fire. The massive guns erupted. The ship shuddered with the recoil. Takeda watched through the rangefinder, waiting for the fall of shot. 40 seconds later, the splashes appeared. Long. Over the target by 1,000 yards. Correct down 1,000 next salvo. Takeda recalculated, adjusted for the error. The computer verified the new solution. Fire. This time the splashes were short, 800 yards under. What the calculations had been perfect. The Type 92 computer had verified them. How could they bracket without hitting? Then Takeda understood. The target was maneuvering frantically, zigzagging, changing speed, turning into and away from the salvos. And the American ships were laying smoke-thick chemical screens that obscured visibility. Manual fire control couldn't track the rate of change fast enough. He could calculate where the target was now, but by the time the shells arrived 40 seconds later, the target had changed course again. The Type 92 computer couldn't predict enemy maneuvers, couldn't continuously update the solution while the ship was moving. He needed what the Americans had: automated tracking, continuous solution updates, radar that could see through smoke. But he had optical rangefinders and manual computers and doctrine that said this should work. It wasn't working. For over an hour, Yamato fired at the fleeing American ships, salvo after salvo. The crew performed perfectly. The guns operated flawlessly. The shells were exactly as specified, and they couldn't achieve decisive hits. The problem wasn't equipment failure, it was the fundamental limitation of the system. Optical fire control needed stable conditions, predictable targets, clear visibility. The Americans were denying them all of that. Worse, the American destroyers counterattacked. Tiny ships massively outgunned charged directly at the Japanese heavy ships, firing torpedoes, laying smoke, forcing Yamato to maneuver to avoid the torpedo spreads. Every time Yamato turned to avoid torpedoes, the fire control solution was disrupted. Takeda had to recalculate from the beginning. By the time the new solution was ready, the target had moved again. And then Takeda witnessed something that shook him even more than Truk had. One of the American destroyers, a ship displacing maybe 2,000 tons, engaged the heavy cruiser Kumano. The destroyer's 5-inch guns were radar-directed. Even as the destroyer maneuvered at high speed, launching torpedoes and making smoke, her guns kept firing, kept hitting. Kumano, 10,000 tons, armored against 8-inch shells, was damaged by 5-inch fire. Not destroyed, but hit repeatedly, accurately by guns that weighed a fraction of what her own weapons did. The difference was the fire control system. The American radar directors tracked automatically compensated for ship motion and target motion updated solutions continuously. Their 5-inch guns achieved more hits than Yamato's massive 18-inch guns because their system worked in chaotic conditions where optical ranging failed. After 90 minutes of confused action, Admiral Kurita ordered center force to disengage. Commander Yamato was shaking with frustration. We were winning. Their carriers were running. Why withdraw? But Takeda understood. Kurita had looked at the situation and seen the truth. They were expending enormous amounts of ammunition without achieving decisive results. The Americans were fighting with a ferocity that doctrine hadn't predicted. And somewhere beyond the horizon, American fast battleships with radar fire control might be racing to intercept. Yamato turned north, breaking off the action. The decisive battle had happened and Japan had lost, not through courage failing or equipment breaking, but through doctrine, meeting reality and shattering. Takeda sat in his station after the engagement, exhausted and numb. Around him, other gunnery officers were making excuses. Bad luck, poor visibility, aggressive American tactics. But Takeda knew the real reason. Their system had fundamental limitations that no amount of skill or courage could overcome. They had brought optical rangefinders to an electronic war. That evening, as Yamato limped back toward Japan, Takeda wrote another letter to Sachiko. Today I participated in what should have been a great victory. We had overwhelming superiority. We should have destroyed the enemy completely. Instead, we achieved almost nothing and withdrew in confusion. I cannot give details that the censors would forbid, but I can tell you this courage and skill are not enough when the other side has systems that work better than yours. We are fighting bravely, but we are fighting with tools designed for a different war. I do not know how this ends, but I fear I know. He sealed the letter knowing he was probably writing sedition, no longer caring. The remainder of 1944 passed in a haze for both Chen and Takeda, though their experiences could not have been more different. Chen in New Jersey continued operations across the Pacific. More shore bombardments, more fire support for amphibious landings. More targets calculated and destroyed with systematic efficiency. In November, they bombarded positions on Leyte itself, supporting MacArthur's forces as they fought to retake the Philippines. In December, they were back at sea, screening carriers, shooting down the occasional kamikaze aircraft that penetrated the defensive perimeter. Chen had stopped vomiting after bombardments, but he hadn't stopped thinking. Morrison watched him carefully, worried that the kid was internalizing too much, carrying too much weight. One night in December, Morrison found Chen on deck during a quiet watch, staring at the stars. Can't sleep. Chen shook his head. I keep doing the math, Chief. We've fired thousands of shells since I came aboard. Each one calculated to hit something, to destroy something. How many people have died because I did my job correctly? Morrison was quiet for a long moment. You want the truth, kid? I don't know. And I've learned not to calculate it, because knowing wouldn't change anything except making it harder to do the job tomorrow. But shouldn't we know? Shouldn't we understand what we're doing? You understand what you need to understand. You're helping end this war. Every target you destroy, every mission you complete successfully brings us closer to the day when the killing stops. That's the only math that matters. Chen looked at the old chief. You really believe that? I have to, because the alternative is admitting that I've spent my whole adult life getting really good at killing people, and that's a thought I can't live with. Morrison paused. But here's what I also believe: when this war ends, men like you, men who ask these questions, who didn't lose their humanity, those are the men who'll build something better. The ones who just killed without thinking there'll be problems. But you'll remember why we never want to do this again. It was the most Morrison had ever said about the moral weight of their work, and Chen felt something shift inside him. Not absolution, not comfort, but perspective, a way to keep going. For Takeda, the end of 1944 was bleaker. Yamato returned to Japan to Kure Naval Base and essentially sat there. Fuel was too scarce for operations. The few remaining carriers had no aircraft. The combined fleet existed on paper but was effectively finished as a fighting force. Takeda spent his days maintaining systems that would probably never fire in combat again, training crews for battles that would never come, trying to maintain morale among men who understood they were serving on a ship that had failed to justify its existence. In December, intelligence reports filtered through about American operations. They had captured most of the Philippines. Their fast carrier task forces roamed at will, striking targets across the Pacific. Their battleships, including the Iowa-class ships, provided devastating gunfire support to amphibious operations. Takeda read the reports and recognized the pattern. The Americans had created an integrated system. Carriers provided air superiority and strike capability. Battleships screened the carriers and provided shore bombardment. Everything worked together, flexible, adaptable, effective. Japan had created specialized ships for specialized purposes. Yamato for the decisive battleship duel, carriers for supporting operations. They had optimized for the battle they expected rather than building systems that could handle whatever reality presented. And reality had presented something they couldn't handle. On December 31st, as 1944 turned to 1945, Takeda stood on Yamato's deck and looked at the stars. Somewhere up there, American B-29s were probably flying toward Japanese cities, bombing with impunity because Japan no longer had the fighters or fuel to stop them. He thought of his father, old now, living in Kyoto with failing health. He thought of Sachiko and Hana in Tokyo, enduring rationing and bombing raids. He thought of all the men who had died believing in Kantai Kessen, believing their sacrifice would lead to victory, and he understood with perfect clarity that they had all been betrayed. Not by cowardice or incompetence, but by doctrine that couldn't adapt, by assumptions that reality had disproven, by faith in tradition when they needed innovation. Tomorrow would bring 1945. Takeda had no illusions about what the new year would bring. The war was lost. The only question was, how many more would die before Japan accepted that truth? He went below to his small cabin and tried to sleep. In his dreams, he heard shells screaming from the invisible horizon, and this time he knew what they meant. They meant the future had arrived, and the past had no answer for it. Winter settled over the Pacific like a shroud in early 1945, but the cold that gripped Hiroshi Takeda had nothing to do with weather. It was the cold of certainty, the ice that forms in a man's chest when faith dies and only duty remains. Yamato lay anchored at Kure Naval Base, Japan's largest naval installation, less than 15 kilometers from Hiroshima. From the deck, Takeda could see the city's hills, the familiar landscape of home, and beyond that, the smoking ruins of what American B-29 bombers were methodically destroying across the Japanese archipelago. The war that was supposed to have ended with one decisive naval victory had instead become a slow strangulation, and everyone with eyes to see knew how it would end. The fuel shortage had become critical by January. Not scarce. Critical. Yamato's bunkers sat mostly empty, filled with just enough oil to run essential systems to maintain minimum readiness, but nowhere near enough for sustained operations. The largest battleship in the world, built to dominate the decisive battle, spent her days swinging at anchor because Japan could no longer afford to let her sail. On a gray morning in late January, Captain Kosaku Aruga assembled the crew on the forward deck. Aruga was 50 years old, a career officer who had commanded cruisers and destroyers before being given the honor of Yamato. He stood before 2,000 men and delivered news that should have been unthinkable. Effective immediately, all main battery training exercises are suspended. We will focus our efforts on anti-aircraft defense and damage control procedures. The fuel situation requires this adjustment. The words hung in the cold air. The most powerful guns ever mounted on a warship silent. Not because they didn't work, not because the enemy had destroyed them, but because there was no fuel to practice using them. Takeda stood among the assembled officers, felt the weight of it settle on everyone present. This was how empires died. Not in glorious battle, in logistics, in the slow arithmetic of resources that couldn't be replaced, of systems that couldn't sustain themselves, of assumptions that reality had proven false. After the assembly dismissed, Takeda walked the ship alone. He placed his hand on the massive turret of the #1 main battery. The steel was cold. Inside, the 18.1-inch gun barrel extended 45 meters, a triumph of metallurgy and engineering, capable of hurling 3,000-pound shells beyond the horizon. And useless, completely useless. Not because it lacked power, but because power without purpose, without fuel, without the ability to actually reach an enemy who could see you first and shoot you from beyond your own range, was just dead weight. He thought of his father, Captain Kenji Takeda, hero of Tsushima. The old man lived in retirement in Kyoto, now 73 years old, his health failing. Hiroshi had written to him twice in the past month, careful letters that said nothing about doubts or fears, only dutiful reports of service and honor. What Hiroshi wanted to write, what he could never write, was a simple question. Father, did you ever realize that the victory at Tsushima taught us the wrong lesson? You won because you adapted faster than the Russians. You used new technology, new tactics, better training. But then we took that victory and turned it into doctrine, into rigid assumption, into the belief that we could win the same way forever. We stopped adapting. We started believing. And belief without adaptation is just slow suicide. But sons did not question fathers. Students did not challenge teachers. Junior officers did not undermine doctrine. So Hiroshi kept his silence and his doubts and watched winter turn toward spring with the certainty that something terrible was coming. In February, the Navy granted him 7 days leave. Hiroshi traveled to Tokyo, to the small house in Meguro, where Sachiko waited with their daughter Hana. The train ride showed him the reality that official reports never quite captured. Burned out buildings in every city, factories reduced to skeletal frameworks, people thin from rationing, eyes hollow from fear and exhaustion. The B-29s came almost nightly now, and there was nothing Japan could do to stop them. Sachiko met him at the door. She was 30 years old but looked older, worry etched in lines around her eyes. When she embraced him, Hiroshi felt how thin she had become, how the war was consuming everything, everyone. You look tired, she said softly, searching his face. I am tired, Sachi. Not the body, the soul. He had no answer for that. Hana was 6 now, old enough to understand that father's visits were rare and precious, old enough to know that something terrible was happening, even if adults tried to shield her from the details. She ran to Hiroshi with a child's pure joy, and for a moment holding his daughter, Hiroshi could almost forget the world burning around them. That evening, after Hana slept, Sachiko and Hiroshi sat in the small garden behind the house. It was too cold for the cherry trees to bloom, but they would in a month or so if the B-29s didn't burn them first. What happened to you out there? Sachiko asked. Your letters say the right words, but they feel empty. Like you're writing what you're supposed to write, not what you believe. Hiroshi was quiet for a long time. OPSEC meant he couldn't tell her about specific battles, about Truk or Leyte, or the slow realization that Japanese doctrine was obsolete. But he could tell her the truth that mattered. I learned that everything I was taught might be wrong. Not wrong because my teachers lied, but wrong because the world changed, and we didn't change with it. Father's generation won at Tsushima because they adapted to new warfare. Torpedoes, modern gunnery, coordinated fleet action. They took risks, they innovated, and then we took their victory and turned it into gospel, into unchangeable doctrine. We stopped adapting. We started believing that if we just did what worked before, it would work forever. Sachiko listened without interruption, the way she always had, the way Hiroshi needed. Now we're fighting an enemy that adapted faster, that built systems we can't counter, that changed the rules while we were perfecting the old game. And we're losing because courage and skill aren't enough when you're fighting the wrong war. You sound like you've given up, Sachiko said carefully. No, I've accepted reality. There's a difference. Giving up means quitting. Accepting means understanding what you cannot change and doing your duty anyway. He paused. If something happens to me, Sachi, I need you to teach Hana something. Teach her that tradition is valuable, but adaptation is survival. Teach her to question even when questioning is dangerous. That's the lesson my generation learned too late. Sachiko took his hand. You're scaring me. I'm being honest, finally. They sat in silence as the winter night deepened around them, two people who loved each other, trying to find meaning in a world that seemed determined to destroy everything they valued. When Hiroshi returned to Yamato after his leave, he found the ship buzzing with suppressed tension. Something was coming. Officers spoke in hushed tones. The captain and senior staff held closed-door meetings that went late into the night. On April 5th, the summons came. All officers to the wardroom for emergency briefing. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito stood at the head of the table, his face carved from stone. Ito was 54, a traditionalist who had spent his entire career preparing for Kantai Kessen. Now he would lead what remained of the combined fleet surface forces on a mission that mocked everything Kantai Kessen had promised. Gentlemen, American forces have invaded Okinawa. The battle for the homeland approaches. Tomorrow, Yamato will sortie for Operation Tengo. Our mission is to reach Okinawa Beach, the ship on the shore, and use our main batteries as fixed artillery to destroy the American landing fleet. Silence. Complete suffocating silence. Ito continued, his voice flat, offering no comfort. This is a one-way mission. We have been allocated fuel for the transit to Okinawa, but not for return. We will be escorted by the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers. Air cover will be minimal. American carrier forces will almost certainly intercept us before we reach our objective. One of the younger officers, an ensign named Kenji Nakamura, recently assigned to Yamato after graduating from the academy, raised his hand with visible trembling. Kenji was 22, fresh-faced, still believing in the possibility of victory. Sir, this is a suicide mission. This is a mission of honor, Ito corrected coldly. The Emperor expects every man to do his duty. This is our Kantai Kessen, not the one we plan, not the one we train for, but the one we have. After the briefing, Takeda found Kenji in the passageway outside the wardroom. The young ensign looked lost, his face pale with shock. Sir, Kenji's voice cracked. Sir, we cannot possibly succeed. They will find us. Their aircraft will destroy us. How is this anything but suicide? Takeda pulled the younger man into an empty compartment, shut the door. When he spoke, his voice carried a gentleness he hadn't known he possessed. You're right, Kenji. This is suicide. Glorious suicide, they'll call it. Heroic sacrifice. But suicide nonetheless. Then why? Why go? Why throw away our lives for nothing? Takeda looked at the young officer, saw himself 12 years ago full of faith and certainty. Because refusing means dishonor. Because the alternative is admitting that everything we built, everything we believed was for nothing. At least this way, our deaths will have meaning. What meaning will never reach Okinawa? We'll die without achieving anything. Maybe, or maybe our deaths will teach someone something worth learning. Maybe some young officer 50 years from now will study this battle and understand doctrine without adaptation kills. Pride without pragmatism destroys. Takeda gripped Kenji's shoulder. If you survive this, Kenji, tell that story. Tell the truth. That's worth dying for. Kenji looked at him with wide eyes. You think I'll survive? Someone has to. Someone has to live to tell what happened here and why. Let it be you. That night, Takeda wrote his final letter to Sachiko. Not the carefully worded, official correspondence that would be censored and filed, but real words sealed in an envelope he gave to the ship's chaplain with instructions to deliver only if Takeda died. My dearest Sachiko and precious Hannah, by the time you read this, the battle will be over and I will be gone. I want you to know that I go with open eyes. I know this mission will fail. I know we are sailing to our deaths. But I am samurai, and samurai do their duty even when duty means dying for a cause that is already lost. Father taught me honor. You taught me love. I hope I have honored both. Hana-chan, grow up strong and questioning. Don't believe something just because tradition says it's true. Test, verify, adapt. That's the lesson your father learned too late. I love you both beyond words. Live well. Remember me not for how I died, but for what I hoped you would become. He sealed the letter, gave it to the chaplain, and lay in his bunk, staring at the overhead, listening to the ship creak and groan around him, this massive monument to assumptions that had proven fatal. April 7th, 1945 dawned clear and cold. At 0800 hours, Yamato weighed anchor and began moving down the Bungo Channel toward the open Pacific. Behind her steamed Yahagi and the 8 destroyers, a pathetic remnant of the fleet that was supposed to have dominated the ocean. Takeda stood at his station in the main battery fire control center, checking systems one final time. Everything was perfect. The 18.1-inch guns were in peak condition. The Type 92 Shigekiban computer was calibrated precisely. The optical rangefinders were cleaned and aligned, everything ready for a battle that would never happen. Commander Yamada, the senior gunnery officer, moved among the crew with forced confidence, offering encouragement that rang hollow. Today we show the Americans what Japanese gunnery can do. Today, we prove that Yamato is the finest battleship ever built. Takeda said nothing. He had stopped arguing with Yamada months ago. Some men would believe until the very end, and there was a certain mercy in that, a shield against the terrible knowledge that you were dying for nothing. By 1000 hours, they had cleared the Bungo Channel and entered the Philippine Sea. Takeda looked back at the Japanese coastline receding in the distance. Somewhere over those hills, Sachiko and Hana were living their lives unaware that Hiroshi was sailing to his death. At 1200 hours, sonar reported submarine contact. An American submarine shadowing the task force reporting their position. Commander Yamada barely reacted. The destroyer screen will handle it. Stay on course. But Takeda knew better. That submarine wasn't trying to attack. It was tracking, reporting, vectoring in the carrier aircraft that would destroy them. He thought, they know exactly where we are. They know our speed, our course, our composition. And they're coming. At 1220 hours, the lookout shouted the report everyone had been dreading and expecting. Aircraft contacts bearing 080 high altitude. Many contacts. Takeda grabbed binoculars, looked to the east. The sky was darkening, not with clouds, with aircraft. He counted quickly, stopped counting at 100, kept watching as more appeared. 200 aircraft, maybe more. Helldivers, Avengers, Hellcats. The entire striking power of multiple American carrier task forces concentrated on destroying one battleship. This was how they would die. Not in glorious gun duels against enemy battleships, not in the decisive fleet engagement that doctrine had promised, but under bombs and torpedoes delivered by aircraft from carriers that would never come within range of Yamato's guns. Just like Musashi at Leyte, just like every assumption about naval warfare destroyed by the reality of carrier aviation. All anti-aircraft batteries commence firing, Yamada shouted. Main battery load, Sanshiki anti-aircraft shells. The order was almost laughable. Yamato carried the Type 96 25mm anti-aircraft gun, manually aimed, hand-loaded, effective against perhaps 1 or 2 aircraft in ideal conditions. They were about to face 200. The Sanshiki shells, special anti-aircraft munitions for the main guns, were a desperate innovation designed to explode in mid-air and spray shrapnel. They had been tested in exercises. They had never proven particularly effective. But desperate times demanded desperate measures. The first wave of torpedo bombers came in low from both sides simultaneously. American doctrine, Takeda realized with distant admiration. Attack from multiple bearings to prevent the ship from turning into the torpedoes. Force it to present beam aspect to at least one wave. Yamato's anti-aircraft guns opened fire, filling the sky with tracers. But Takeda could see the truth immediately. The guns couldn't track fast enough, couldn't engage enough targets. The American pilots were experienced, coordinated, pressing their attacks through the flak with grim determination. The first torpedo hit the port side at 1225. Takeda felt the explosion through the deck plates, a massive concussion that made the entire ship shudder. Then another. He ran to the damage control station where reports were flooding in. Flooding in compartments 357, counter-flooding initiated list developing port side. The executive officer, a veteran of 20 years at sea, shouted orders with mechanical precision. Counter-flood starboard tanks, all damage control parties report status. But more torpedoes were coming, more bombs. The American pilots were relentless, wave after wave, coordinated and professional, systematically destroying the ship that had been built to be unsinkable. Takeda moved through the chaos, helping where he could, calculating in the back of his mind how long the ship could survive this punishment. Yamato's armor was the thickest ever mounted on a battleship. Her torpedo defense system was sophisticated, designed to absorb multiple hits. But she had been designed to fight other battleships to survive hits from armor-piercing shells, not this sustained aerial assault. Every design had assumptions. Yamato's assumptions were being systematically disproven by reality. By 1300 hours, the list had reached 15 degrees. Water was pouring into ruptured compartments faster than pumps could handle it. Fires burned in multiple locations. The ship was dying, and everyone knew it. Takeda found himself on the weather deck helping carry wounded men to the medical station. The scene was apocalyptic. Aircraft swarmed like insects, bombs exploding across the superstructure, torpedoes slamming into the hull with methodical regularity. He encountered Ensign Kenji near the #2 turret. The young officer was wounded, blood running from a gash on his forehead, his uniform torn, pinned partially under a fallen beam. "Sir," Kenji's voice was desperate. "Sir, I can't move, help me." Takeda dropped to his knees, tried to lift the beam. Too heavy. He looked around for help, but the deck was chaos, everyone fighting to survive, to save the ship that was clearly beyond saving. "Kenji, I'll get you out. Hold on." "Sir, did we hit anything? Did our guns hit any of them?" Takeda stopped trying to lift the beam, looked at the young officer with something like compassion. "No, Kenji, we didn't." "Then what was the point? Why did we come here to die for nothing?" Takeda gripped the younger man's hand. "The point is that someone survives to tell the truth. Listen to me carefully. If you live through this, remember what I told you. Tell people that courage without wisdom is waste, that tradition without adaptation is death. Make our deaths mean something by teaching that lesson." An explosion rocked the ship. The deck tilted violently. The beam shifted, but instead of crushing down harder, it rolled slightly, creating just enough space for Kenji to pull free. "Go," Takeda shouted. "Get to a life raft, survive, tell the story." Kenji hesitated. Then another explosion made the decision for him. He stumbled away toward the rail, toward the life rafts that were being deployed. Takeda looked up, saw part of the forward fire control tower collapsing. He had perhaps 3 seconds to recognize what was happening before tons of steel came down on top of him. His last thought was of Hannah, his daughter, 6 years old, playing in the garden. He hoped she would grow up in a world that learned from mistakes like the one that was killing him. Then darkness. At 14:23 hours on April 7th, 1945, Yamato's forward magazine detonated. The explosion was visible from 160 kilometers away. A mushroom cloud rose 6 kilometers into the sky. The largest battleship ever built, the embodiment of Kantai Kessen, the symbol of Japanese naval supremacy, broke in half and sank in less than 2 minutes. Of 3,332 men aboard, 276 survived. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito went down with his swim, as did Captain Kosaku Aruga and Commander Yamada and Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Takeda. Ensign Kenji Nakamura, against all probability, survived. He found himself in the water, pulled aboard a life raft by men from destroyer Yukikaze, one of the few escorts to survive the engagement. As Yukikaze limped back toward Japan, Kenji sat wrapped in a blanket, shaking not from cold but from shock, replaying Takeda's final words over and over. "Tell people that courage without wisdom is waste, that tradition without adaptation is death." He would spend the rest of his life honoring that promise. 12,000 kilometers away, aboard USS New Jersey operating off Okinawa, Bobby Chen monitored radio traffic from the airstrikes with growing numbness. The pilots' voices came through clear and professional, reporting their attacks with a detachment of men doing a difficult job. "Splash one, that's a hit on the battleship. She's burning. 2 torpedoes, both hit the target. She's listing heavy. Jesus, how many hits does it take? She's still moving. 17 torpedoes. Confirmed 17 torpedo hits. Multiple bombs. She's finally rolling over. Mushroom cloud. The whole thing just exploded like a goddamn nuke." Sam Morrison stood next to Chen, listening to the same radio traffic, his face grim. The intelligence officer consulted his identification manual, made the confirmation everyone already knew. "Gentlemen, that was the battleship Yamato. Largest battleship ever built. Sunk by carrier aircraft. Never got within gun range of a single American ship." Chen felt something twist in his chest. All that engineering, all that effort, all those men. The Japanese equivalent of Iowa, built with the same care, the same precision, the same faith in their system. Destroyed without ever fulfilling her intended purpose. Morrison spoke quietly, almost to himself. There's the lesson again. Build for one specific battle, and you die when that battle doesn't come. Chen touched the Mark 8 radar console, the system that had helped make American naval dominance possible. He thought of the enemy fire control officer somewhere on that ship, maybe one of the men who died in that mushroom cloud. A man who probably understood systems as well as Chen did, who probably believed in his equipment, his training, his doctrine, who had been given tools that couldn't win the war his nation was fighting and had died trying anyway. Chief, Chen said softly, do you ever think about them, the men we're killing? Every damn day, kid. Every single day. How do you live with it? Morrison was quiet for a long moment. I tell myself it's them or us. I tell myself we didn't start this war. I tell myself every enemy ship we sink, every position we destroy, shortens this war and saves lives in the long run. He paused. And I tell myself that when it's over, when we've won, we better make damn sure we learn the right lessons. Because next time we might be the ones holding on to doctrine while someone else invents the future. Chen nodded slowly, understanding that Morrison had just given him the only comfort available purpose. The war would end, the killing would stop, and then the survivors would have to build something better from the ashes, or none of it would mean anything. The war ground toward its inevitable conclusion through the spring and summer of 1945. New Jersey and her sisters participated in the final act's operations that would have seemed impossible, unthinkable at the war's beginning. In July, American battleships bombarded the Japanese home islands directly. USS Iowa, Missouri, and Wisconsin, along with the other heavy units, steamed off the coast of Hokkaido and shelled the Nihon Steel Company and Wenatchee Iron Works at Murin. Chen stood at his fire control station during the night bombardment of July 14th through 15th, tracking targets with radar-feeding solutions to the guns, watching the shells arc out into darkness toward an enemy mainland that could no longer defend itself effectively. The numbers were clinical: 156 rounds of 16-inch high-capacity shells, 25,000 yards range, perfect accuracy, industrial targets destroyed, secondary fires consuming residential areas. Over 2,000 houses burned. Chen calculated trajectories and recorded results and tried not to think about the people in those houses. Tried to remember Morrison's words about shortening the war, about saving lives in the long run. After the bombardment, Morrison found Chen on deck, staring toward the Japanese coast where fires still burned. You okay, kid? We just destroyed thousands of homes, Chief. We destroyed a steel plant that makes armor for kamikaze aircraft. And the people who lived near it, they chose to be there. Morrison sighed. Chen, war is the worst thing humans do to each other. No way to make it clean or fair or just. But you know what's worse than this bombardment invading Japan? Millions dead, theirs and ours. Every shell we fire brings us closer to the end. That's the only math that matters now. Chen nodded, but the weight didn't lift. It never really did. On August 15th, the Emperor's radio broadcast announced Japan's surrender. Chen heard it played over the ship's intercom, the thin, reedy voice speaking archaic Japanese that few aboard could understand, but the meaning was clear. It was over. Men cheered, celebrated, broke out contraband alcohol, and toasted victory. Chen went to his bunk and lay in darkness, feeling nothing but exhaustion. They had won. The system had worked. Radar-directed fire control, carrier task forces, industrial capacity, technological adaptation, and all of it had proven superior to Japanese doctrine and Japanese faith. But victory felt hollow in a way Chen hadn't anticipated. He had expected triumph. Instead, he felt tired and shot and old to beyond his 29 years. On September 2nd, 1945, Chen stood on the deck of USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay as the formal surrender ceremony took place. Missouri had been chosen deliberately. An Iowa-class battleship, the newest and most powerful type of American battleship, floating in sight of the Japanese capital. The symbolism couldn't be missed. Japanese officials boarded the ship in morning coats and formal military uniforms, walked past the 16-inch gun turrets that represented their defeat, and signed the surrender documents on a table draped with the flag Commodore Perry had flown when he opened Japan to the West 92 years earlier. Chen watched from his position among the assembled officers. Studied the Japanese faces looking for something he couldn't quite name. Defeat, yes. Exhaustion. But also a kind of hollow dignity, the bearing of men who had lost everything but refused to surrender their humanity. He wondered if any of them had known Takeda, the officer he imagined on Yamato, the man who might have operated systems similar to Chen's own, who might have questioned doctrine, the way Chen questioned the morality of efficient killing. In the weeks after the surrender, Chen was assigned to technical inspection teams cataloging Japanese naval equipment. He traveled to Kure Naval Base where Yamato had been built, and based where the surviving facilities still stood among the wreckage of American bombing. A Japanese technical officer, middle-aged and weary, gave Chen a tour of the fire control systems that had equipped their battleships. The man spoke some English enough to explain the equipment. This is Type 92 Shigekibun, fire control computer, manual input mechanical calculation, very accurate, very precise, but slow. Chen examined the device carefully. It was beautifully engineered, precise mechanical work, elegant in its way, but fundamentally manual, dependent on human input at every stage, limited by the speed of human calculation. Who operated these systems? Chen asked. Best students, best mathematics, best eyes, many years training. They could calculate very fast. I'm sure they could, but did you ever consider automated input integrating radar with fire control? The officer was quiet for a moment. We had radar, Type 22, but doctrine said optical superior, electronic unreliable. So we never integrated properly, never made system like you have. Chen felt a wave of something he couldn't quite identify. Sympathy, grief. I'm sorry. The Japanese officer looked confused. Sorry you won. I'm sorry your men were sent to fight with tools that couldn't win. They deserved better than doctrine that didn't adapt. The officer's eyes filled with tears. He looked away quickly, but not before Chen saw. Many good men died believing. Believing in ships, believing in training, believing doctrine would work. I know. We had men who believed too, but we were lucky. Our doctrine turned out to be closer to right. That doesn't make us better men, just luckier. Later that day, Chen interviewed Japanese survivors gathering information for intelligence reports. One of them was a young officer, maybe 22, thin from months as a prisoner of war with scars on his face from burns. His name was Kenji Nakamura. He had served on Yamato. You were on Yamato's final sortie, Chen asked through an interpreter. Yes, Fire Control Division. What was it like? Kenji was quiet for a long time, staring at nothing. When he spoke, his voice was flat, emptied of emotion. We knew we would die, but we thought maybe we damaged you enough to matter. Instead, your aircraft destroyed us before we saw one American ship. All that power, all that training, wasted. You're a fire control officer. What happened to him? Lieutenant Commander Takeda. He died when the ship exploded. Kenji paused. But before the end, he told me something. He said to remember it, to tell people if I survived. What did he say? He said courage without wisdom is waste. That tradition without adaptation is death. He wanted me to live so I could tell people, so they would learn. Chen felt something break inside him, some barrier he had maintained between himself and the enemy, between victor and vanquished. Takeda. He had a name now, not an abstract enemy fire control officer, but a real man. Hiroshi Takeda, who had questioned his own doctrine, who had sent a young officer to survive and tell the truth. A man very much like Chen himself, except his system had been on the losing side. He sounds like a wise man, Chen said softly. He was. Others called him defeatist because he questioned. But he wasn't defeatist. He was realistic. He saw the truth and tried to report it, and they told him he was wrong because truth was inconvenient. Kenji looked directly at Chen. Your doctrine was better, but it could have been you on the losing side. If circumstances were different, if your leaders had been stubborn, like ours. What separates us is not virtue, just luck and timing. Chen had no answer for that because Kenji was absolutely right. The years that followed taught Chen that the lessons of the war extended far beyond 1945. In 1950, the Korean War broke out. USS New Jersey was recommissioned, her 16-inch guns once again providing shore bombardment. Chen, now a full commander, served aboard her again, older and wiser and still questioning. Sam Morrison had retired by then, settled in a small town in Nebraska. But he wrote letters, and Chen treasured every one. One letter in particular stayed with Chen. "Kid, heard you're heading back to war." 5 years later, same ship, same gun, still relevant. Meanwhile, Yamato's been at the bottom of the East China Sea since '45. Purpose-built superiority versus adaptable versatility. History already chose the winner. The lesson holds. Stay safe. Stay human. Sam. Chen carried that letter through the Korean War, through years of peacetime service, through a career that took him to captain and eventually rear admiral. He retired in 1970 after 28 years in the Navy. Morrison died in 1973 at 71 in his sleep. Chen flew to Nebraska for the funeral, stood in a small country church, and said goodbye to the man who had taught him that technology without humanity was just efficient killing. In 1995, 50 years after the war's end, an elderly Bobby Chen attended a memorial ceremony at Oasis, New Jersey, now a museum ship in Camden. He was 79 years old, a retired rear admiral, his hair white, his hands unsteady, but his mind still sharp. The ceremony included a special guest, Kenji Nakamura, 73, representing the survivors of Yamato. They stood together at the Mark 38 Fire Control Director, these two old men who had been enemies who had survived, while others died who carried the burden of memory. Kenji placed a memorial plaque on the director pedestal. It read in English and Japanese, "In memory of Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Takeda and all sailors who served with honor." Chen added a wreath of flowers. They stood in silence for a moment, then Kenji spoke his English, much improved over the decades. "Your system was better. Your doctrine was better. But both of us know it could have been different. You could have been the ones clinging to obsolete doctrine while we innovated. War is not about virtue, just about who adapts faster." Chen nodded slowly. Takeda understood that. So did my chief Morrison. The best men on both sides knew the truth. The tragedy is that the systems didn't listen to the best men. That's the lesson then. Build systems that listen, that question, that adapt. Not monuments to ideas that cannot change. They shook hands, these ancient enemies, united by loss and wisdom, and the hard-earned understanding that comes from surviving when others didn't. Later over tea, Kenji told Chen about Takeda's final moments, about the words he had spoken, about the letter he had written to his wife and daughter. He wanted Hana to learn to question, Kenji said, to not believe something just because tradition said it was true. That was the lesson he died trying to teach. Did she learn it? Chen asked. I visited his family into the 50s, told them his final words. Hana grew up, became a teacher, taught her students to think critically, to question assumptions. Kenji smiled sadly. So yes, his death had meaning. Chen thought of all the men he had killed efficiently and from beyond the horizon. Thought of all the questions he had asked Morrison about the morality of it. Thought of how Morrison had told him that asking the questions was what kept him human. We did terrible things, Chen said quietly. Both sides, efficient, systematic, terrible things. Yes, but we also learned. That has to mean something. In 2016, Bobby Chen died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 100. His obituary mentioned his Navy career, his technical contributions to fire control systems, his post-war work advocating for international cooperation. It didn't mention the questions he had asked every day of his adult life about the cost of efficiency, the price of victory, the weight of survival. But his children knew, and they taught their children. And the lesson persisted. In 2024, Kenji's grandson visited USS Iowa in Los Angeles with his American girlfriend, a young woman of Chinese descent, whose great-grandfather had served in the U.S. Navy during the war. They stood together at the radar console, these young people for whom World War II was ancient history, and listened to the tour guide explain how the Mark 8 system had revolutionized naval warfare. My grandfather served on Yamato, the young man said quietly. He said they lost because they couldn't adapt fast enough. My great-grandfather served on New Jersey, the woman replied. He said they won because the ship could evolve, could serve for 50 years, because it wasn't built for just one purpose. They looked at each other, then at the radar console. Is there a lesson for us, he asked. Today, I mean, in our world. She thought about it, about the rapid changes in technology, about artificial intelligence and automation and disruption. Yeah, when the paradigm changes, you either adapt or become obsolete in warfare, in business, in life. Same lesson, different era. And if you're stuck in old ways, then you're Yamato, magnificent, powerful, and ultimately irrelevant. They stood in silence, these descendants of enemies, living in a world their ancestors had fought to shape, trying to learn the lessons that had been bought with so much blood. The lesson endured. It always would. Because human nature didn't change only the tools and the challenges. Some would adapt. Some would cling to what worked before. And history would continue to reward the former and destroy the latter. In the end, that was what Hiroshi Takeda had died trying to teach. What Bobby Chen had spent a lifetime trying to learn. What Sam Morrison had understood from the beginning. Not that one nation or one system was inherently superior, but that survival itself required the humility to question, the courage to change, and the wisdom to recognize when doctrine had become dogma. The thunder beyond the horizon had spoken its lesson in fire and steel, and the deaths of brave men who deserved better than to die for assumptions that couldn't evolve. The lesson remained adapt or perish. The choice remained faith or wisdom. And somewhere in the minds of young people standing in museums and studying history and facing their own technological revolutions, the choice would be made again and again and again, forever.